When a young black boy is wrongly removed from first class by a prejudiced flight attendant, she assumes he doesn't belong among the wealthy passengers. But she has no idea who his father is. What starts as a humiliating incident quickly turns into a brutal lesson in power, privilege, and justice. The father, a highly influential businessman, won't let this slide. And by the time the flight lands, the flight attendant's world will never be the same. The first-class cabin was a world of luxury. Plush leather seats, soft ambient lighting, and champagne glasses clinking as well-dressed passengers settled into their seats. The air carried an air of exclusivity, where everyone assumed only the wealthy, powerful, or privileged belonged. But that illusion shattered in an instant. A flight attendant paused mid-stride, her expression tightening as her gaze landed on a young black boy no older than 10, sitting quietly in his seat. Her arms crossed, her lips pursed. "You need to return to economy," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "First class isn't for you." The boy's brows furrowed in confusion. He looked up at her, blinking. "But this is my seat." Passengers stiffened. Some pretended not to hear, suddenly very interested in their drinks. Others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension rising. But the flight attendant wasn't listening. Her eyes flicked to the back of the plane, and she gestured toward economy. "Move now, or I'll call security." What she didn't know, just 3 rows behind them, his father was watching. And by the time this flight landed, she would regret every word she just said. Have you ever faced discrimination in an unexpected place? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The flight was smooth, the atmosphere in first class exuding silent luxury. Plush leather seats, warm towels, and glasses of expensive champagne created an environment of exclusivity. The passengers sat in comfort, wrapped in their own privilege, accustomed to the unwritten rules of this world, where wealth determined status and status determined belonging. Disruptions were rare, and everyone knew their place. Seated quietly, in seat 3A, flipping through the pages of a hardcover book, was Jordan Carter, a 10-year-old black boy. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't making noise, wasn't causing trouble. He was simply reading. And yet that alone was enough to draw the attention of Sandra Blake. Sandra had spent over a decade as a first-class flight attendant. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of this cabin. She could tell who belonged here within seconds. She could spot the hedge fund managers, the celebrities, the CEOs, and, more importantly, she could spot the ones who didn't fit. And Jordan. He did not fit. Sandra's eyes narrowed as she walked past him once, then again, glancing at him from different angles. No sign of a parent or guardian beside him. No designer clothes, no expensive watch, no visible signs of the kind of wealth that first-class passengers carried. Her stomach twisted. There was no way he could have afforded that seat. Had he wandered in from economy? Did someone sneak him in as a favor? Was he a guest of a wealthy passenger who had taken pity on him? Her decision was instant. He didn't belong. Straightening her uniform, she squared her shoulders and strode down the aisle toward him. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her presence demanding attention. She was ready to remove him. What she didn't realize? Just 3 rows behind them, in seat 6C, a man lowered his tablet and watched her every move. Derek Carter, Jordan's father. He sat with an air of quiet authority, dressed in an expensive but understated suit. His presence was the kind that commanded respect without demanding it. Anyone who noticed him might assume he was a businessman, an investor, or someone important. But few would recognize him for what he truly was. A billionaire. Derek Carter wasn't just wealthy. He was the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the country. A man who had started with nothing and built an empire through grit, intelligence, and sheer determination. He knew power, influence, and wealth better than anyone in this cabin. But he also knew something else. Money couldn't erase prejudice. It didn't matter how many businesses he built, how many Forbes lists he appeared on, how many millions sat in his bank account. There would always be people who saw only his skin color before his success. And now, his son was facing it firsthand. Derek's jaw tightened as he watched Sandra march toward Jordan, her expression filled with quiet authority, her mind already made up. She had no idea who she was about to challenge, and by the time this flight landed, she would never make this mistake again. Sandra came to a full stop in front of Jordan's seat, her arms crossing over her neatly pressed uniform. She towered over him, a faint smirk curling on her lips as if she had caught someone sneaking where they didn't belong. The authority in her stance was unmistakable. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her tone clipped. Jordan looked up from his book, confusion flickering across his face. "Yes?" Sandra's eyes flicked to the seat number, then back to him. "This section is for first-class passengers," she stated firmly. "You need to move to your assigned seat in economy." Jordan blinked, processing her words. "But this is my seat." Sandra let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking her head as if he had just told the most ridiculous joke she'd ever heard. Her expression remained composed, but there was a condescending edge to her demeanor. "That's not possible," she said, her voice laced with certainty, as if she knew for a fact that he could not belong in such a place. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing the uncomfortable situation brewing. Some leaned in slightly, intrigued by the unexpected tension, while others buried themselves in their drinks or magazines, preferring to pretend they hadn't noticed at all. Sandra, however, had already decided the conversation was over. Her stance became firmer, her tone sharper. "I'm not asking again," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Move now, or I'll have security remove you." Jordan's fingers curled around the edges of his book, gripping it tighter. His father had always taught him to remain respectful, to stand tall, to never give anyone a reason to look down on him. But right now, in that moment, he felt small. He had done nothing wrong. He had not misbehaved. He had simply taken his seat, the one that rightfully belonged to him, and yet it was still being questioned. For the first time, he fully understood what his father had always tried to shield him from. Some people, no matter how well-mannered, he was, no matter how well-dressed or well-spoken, would always assume the worst of him. Jordan opened his mouth, his heart pounding, about to explain himself, to insist that he belonged here. But before he could get a single word out, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the thick tension of the cabin. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sandra froze. The already quiet first-class cabin became even stiller. Passengers looked up, some pretending not to be invested in the moment while others openly watched. The shift in energy was palpable. From 3 rows behind, Derek Carter stood up. His presence changed everything. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, Derek moved with a quiet authority that turned heads. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked at Sandra with sharp, assessing eyes, that made it clear This was not a man to be dismissed. He stepped forward, closing the space between them with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand attention. The sheer weight of his presence did that for him. Sandra shifted uneasily, gripping the edge of her service tray as Derek's gaze bore into her. Passengers held their breath. They didn't know who this man was, but one thing was certain. This was not going to end the way Sandra had expected, and she was about to realize that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Derek Carter didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't have to. His authority wasn't in the volume of his words. It was in the quiet, controlled fury that simmered beneath them. His presence alone shifted the air in the cabin, making Sandra stand up straighter, her nerves betraying her as she gripped the edges of her service tray. "My son," Derek said slowly, his voice measured and sharp, "is seated exactly where he belongs." His words landed like a thunderclap. The murmurs among passengers grew louder. Eyes that had previously tried to avoid the uncomfortable situation were now fully locked onto the unfolding confrontation. Sandra's breath hitched. She had expected a scared, flustered child. She had expected quick compliance. She had not expected this. Still, she refused to back down completely. I wasn't aware he was with you," she stammered, her voice faltering. She attempted to regain control of the situation, straightening her back, but Derek's presence was impossible to ignore. The way he stood, tall, unwavering, his dark eyes pinning her in place, made it clear that this was not just another passenger. This was a man with power. Derek tilted his head slightly, examining her like she was an equation he was solving. "So," he said, his tone deceptively calm, "if a black child sits in first class, you assume he doesn't belong? Is that it?" The murmurs intensified. A few passengers gasped softly. Others whispered behind their hands, pretending not to be invested but watching every second unfold. A man in an expensive gray suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman clutched her designer purse a little, tighter, pretending to check something on her phone while keeping her ears open. Sandra felt the weight of their eyes on her. She tried to keep her composure, but her face betrayed her. Her confidence cracked just slightly. "No, sir," she blurted out. I was just—" Derek took a step forward. "You were just—" "What?" he interrupted, his voice controlled yet laced with undeniable authority. "Publicly humiliating a child based on your assumptions." Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't checked his ticket. She hadn't asked for clarification. She had simply looked at a black child sitting alone in first class and assumed, without question, that he wasn't supposed to be there, and now there was no way to undo it. The silence that followed was oppressive. For the first time in her years of working first class, Sandra felt small. Derek could have ended it right there. He could have turned back to his seat, ignored her, and let the shame of the moment swallow her whole. But he wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. A cold rush of panic flooded her system as she immediately understood what was about to happen. Passengers around them recognized the shift. A few turned to each other in hushed tones. Others simply sat in stunned silence. The man in the gray suit stole another glance at Derek, realization dawning on him. This wasn't just any man. Derek held his phone firmly in his grasp. "I suggest you call your supervisor right now," he said, his tone dangerously calm. his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Sandra felt her stomach drop. This was no longer just an uncomfortable exchange. This was a threat to her career. Derek didn't need to yell. He didn't need to demand anything. The sheer weight of his calm, calculated words carried the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. Sandra swallowed hard, her throat dry. I, she stuttered, her eyes darting toward the other flight attendants at the front of the cabin, hoping for support. But they weren't coming to her defense. One of them, a younger woman, had her head slightly bowed, her lips pressed together as if embarrassed. The other simply looked away, because they knew. They had seen what happened, and now there was no undoing it. Because by the time this plane lands, Derek continued, his voice ice cold, I'll be making sure you never treat another passenger like this again. Sandra's hands trembled. She could feel everything crumbling. She had made a huge mistake, and there was no coming back from it. Before Sandra could gather herself enough to respond, a new presence entered the situation. A senior flight attendant, her navy blue uniform neatly pressed, approached with a tight expression. Unlike Sandra, she had the air of someone who knew how to handle high-profile passengers. Her name tag read Linda Mayfield, and the concern in her eyes was immediate. She had heard the commotion from the front of the cabin and had already started piecing together what had happened. Derek didn't wait for her to speak. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, embossed business card. Without a word, he held it out to her. Linda took it, and the second she saw the name printed in bold, elegant letters, her breath hitched. Derek Carter. It was a name impossible to ignore. The kind of name that held weight in every industry. Tech, media, business, and now, it seemed, aviation. Sandra shifted nervously, eyes darting between Derek and Linda. She hadn't even bothered to ask for his name before jumping to conclusions. Derek's voice was cool, controlled, but edged with quiet authority. I assume your airline values customer service, he said, his gaze unwavering. Linda exhaled sharply, nodding before even responding. Of course, sir. Her hands tightened around the business card. She already knew what was coming next. She turned sharply toward Sandra, her expression shifting from concern to barely contained fury. You removed a child from his assigned first-class seat? She demanded, her voice laced with disbelief. Sandra opened her mouth, but no excuse felt strong enough to justify what she had done. I thought he was alone, she finally stammered, her voice losing the false confidence it once held. Derek let out a low, mirthless chuckle. The sound was controlled but cutting, carrying the weight of his deep frustration and disbelief. And even if he was, he said slowly, would that be a reason to treat him any differently? Sandra had no answer, because the truth was written all over her actions. She hadn't asked Jordan for a boarding pass. She hadn't offered him the same courtesy she would have given any other first-class passenger. She had simply looked at a young black boy in first class and assumed he didn't belong. The silence that followed was damning. Linda let out a heavy sigh. The damage had been done. She turned back to Derek, her shoulders squared as she prepared to offer the apology that Sandra should have given long ago. Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize on behalf of our airline. This is not... Derek raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. I don't need an apology, he said evenly, his voice sharper than before. He took a step closer, his gaze never breaking from hers. I need accountability. And he fully intended to get it. By the time the plane began its descent, Sandra's fate had already been sealed. Derek Carter had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to cause a scene. Power wasn't always about how loud you could be. It was about knowing that when you spoke, people listened. And today, the airline was listening. While most passengers remained seated, buckling up as the plane approached the runway, Sandra sat stiffly near the front of the cabin. The proud, dismissive confidence she had earlier was completely gone. Now, her hands trembled as she clutched a small notepad, nervously scribbling notes as she spoke in hushed, urgent tones with Linda Mayfield, the senior flight attendant. Linda's posture was stiff, her lips pursed. Unlike Sandra, she knew exactly how serious the situation had become. Her words were short, clipped, like someone who had already made up their mind. Passengers whispered among themselves. Everyone had seen what happened. No one had forgotten the moment Sandra had tried to remove a child from first class, only to find out that the boy's father was one of the most powerful men on the plane. And now, Sandra was realizing something far too late. There are some mistakes you can't take back. The airline's head supervisor had already been informed. Calls were being made, reports were being sent, and by the time this plane completed its return trip, Sandra's name would no longer be listed on the airline's payroll. But Derek Carter? He never looked back at her, because this moment wasn't about her. She was just a reminder of something, bigger. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied toward the gate, Derek closed his tablet, smoothing his suit as he prepared to disembark. Beside him, Jordan quietly gathered his belongings. The boy hadn't said much since the confrontation, but Derek could sense his thoughts, the silent questions, the uncertainty of what today's lesson truly meant. This was why Derek had never wanted his son to experience something like this, not because Jordan wasn't strong enough to handle it, but because no child should have to. As Derek and Jordan stepped into the aisle ready to leave the plane, they were met with a new flight attendant at the exit. A younger man, maybe in his late 20s, with a neatly pressed uniform and an apologetic expression. His posture was straight, his hands clasped in front of him in a formal, professional stance. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice even but respectful. "On behalf of our airline, I'd like to personally apologize for what happened today." Derek studied him for a moment. He could tell the man was being genuine, nervous even. This was someone who understood the gravity of what had happened. Derek gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply. The flight attendant exhaled in relief, then turned to Jordan with a small smile. "I hope you had a good flight, young man." Jordan hesitated, then nodded. He didn't quite smile, but he gave a small, polite response. And with that, they exited the plane. The airport terminal was alive with movement. People rushing to their gates, announcements crackling over the speakers, the sound of luggage rolling across polished floors. Derek and Jordan walked side by side, but the boy was quiet. And then, finally, he spoke. "You didn't have to do all that for me." Derek stopped walking. He turned toward his son, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I did," he said. Jordan looked up, his brows slightly furrowed. "But why? I mean, I didn't get hurt or anything. She just—" He hesitated. "She just thought I didn't belong there." Derek inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "Son," he said, kneeling slightly so he was at Jordan's eye level. "It wasn't just about you." Jordan blinked. It wasn't. Derek gave a small, sad smile. No, it was about every black child who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Jordan stayed silent, absorbing that. Derek continued. There are people in this world who see your skin before they see your worth. And no matter how smart you are, how kind, or how hardworking, some people will always assume you don't deserve to be in certain places. Jordan shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the truth sat heavy on his young shoulders. But I didn't do anything wrong, he muttered. Derek nodded. Exactly. A moment of understanding passed between them. Jordan looked down at his feet, kicking at the floor gently. Did that happen to you too? He asked quietly. Derek let out a small chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Oh, son, he said, more times than I can count. Jordan bit his lip. He had never really thought about that before. He had always seen his father as unstoppable, powerful, respected. But now he realized his dad hadn't always been those things. He had been a black boy once, just like him, and he had faced the same kind of assumptions, the same kind of dismissals, the same quiet battles. But he had never let them define him. That was the real lesson. Not just to fight back, but to prove them wrong. Derek gave his son's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Next time someone doubts you, don't argue, he said. Let your success be the loudest response. Jordan took a deep breath and nodded. Okay. Derek smiled, standing up tall once more. This wouldn't be the last time his son faced discrimination. But today, he knew his son would never forget the lesson, because Derek Carter had made sure of it. As Derek Carter and his son walked out of the airport, the weight of the moment still lingered. This wasn't just about a flight attendant's prejudice or a single uncomfortable encounter. It was about a much larger reality that so many people face every day. But today, Derek had made sure his son learned a valuable lesson. He had shown him that power isn't just about money. It's about knowing when to use it, knowing when to stand up, and knowing that silence is never the answer when injustice occurs. And today, Derek Carter used it well. Have you ever experienced or witnessed discrimination in an unexpected place? How did you handle it? Did you speak up, or did you hesitate, unsure if it was worth the fight? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can spread awareness about moments like these. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life lessons like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will change the way you see the world. See you in the next one.